The events you're about to see are based on real accounts. To protect the identities of those involved, names and details have been changed. My name is Howard Nielsen. I'm 64 years old and I live in Rochester, New York. I've never been someone who believed in paranormal things. I always thought those ghost stories and haunted houses were nonsense. But what I'm going to share here happened to me in 1977, 3 years after the DeFeo murders and 2 years after the Lutz family fled that house. I'm not one to exaggerate things, and to this day I try to understand what happened that night. Back then, I worked as a plumber and did some side jobs as an electrician around Long Island. A guy I knew, Ben, had bought an old house in the area and called me to check out the plumbing. He knew I did an honest job for a fair price, so I accepted right away. It was a regular day, kind of rainy, and I got there around 8 in the morning. When I parked in front of the house, I felt a strange chill, but I thought it was just the cold from the rain. Only later did I realize the house was that one, the infamous Amityville house. Ben hadn't mentioned it was that place. I would have refused the job just knowing the horrible reputation it had. But I was already there, and money is money. The house looked ordinary, but it had a heavy atmosphere, like the air was thicker. Ben wasn't there. He left a key under the doormat and asked me to fix some pipe issues in the basement. I went in without thinking much, already wanting to get it over with. The smell was the first thing that bothered me. There was a strange odor, like something sweet and rotten at the same time. The house was empty, which only made the place feel colder and more uncomfortable. I went down to the basement and started messing with the pipes. It was basic work, but the environment made everything feel more complicated. With every noise, I turned around expecting to see someone standing behind me, even though I knew I was completely alone. The basement was awful. The walls were damp, and I swear there was a metallic smell in the air, almost like rust. I kept working, trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I heard what sounded like a whisper coming from the darkest corner of the basement. I stopped working, trying to convince myself it was just the wind blowing through some crack. But there were no windows down there. There shouldn't have been any breeze. I took a deep breath and kept working. I wasn't going to leave without getting paid, no matter how uncomfortable I was. But the whispers continued, always low, like someone trying to say something I couldn't understand. It felt like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I tried to ignore them, but the chill running down my neck wouldn't let me. The house was cold, but I was sweating, and then something happened that still makes me question my sanity. I was almost done with the job when I heard heavy footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought Ben had come back, but then I remembered he wouldn't be back until the end of the day. I left the basement, climbed the stairs carefully, and called out for him. No response. I looked around the house and didn't see anything unusual, but the silence seemed to be screaming. That's when I realized the strange smell was even stronger upstairs. It almost made me sick. I followed the smell and it led me to one of the bedrooms. When I entered, it felt like the temperature had dropped several degrees, and then I saw the worst of it. In the corner of the room, a green stain was oozing down the wall like the house itself was bleeding that weird substance. The texture was strange, thick, like a slime that shouldn't be there. I had heard the Lutz family's stories, but I never thought any of that was real. But there it was, right in front of me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I was going to pass out. I took a step back, trying to decide whether to clean that thing up or just leave everything and get out. But something told me not to touch it, like it was dangerous somehow. And then, without any warning, the bedroom door slammed shut with so much force that I almost fell backward. My ears were ringing from the impact, and I could only think about getting out of that house immediately. I ran, stumbling through the hallways until I found the front door. When I crossed the front yard, I could still hear the muffled sound of something banging inside, like the house itself was moving. I threw my tools in the car and got out of there as fast as I could. I never went back to collect my payment. I never wanted to hear about that house or anything related to it again. A few days later, Ben called me asking why I didn't finish the job. I lied, told him something personal had come up and that he should hire someone else. I never told him what I saw and heard that day. He laughed and said I sounded scared. Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. I never worked in that area again and never accepted jobs without knowing exactly what I was getting into. To this day, when I remember that basement and that green slime dripping down the wall, I get a chill that seems to crawl down my entire spine. I don't know if it was all in my head or if that house truly holds something evil. But I have never been able to forget. My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago. At the time, I had just moved into a house built in the 1870s. I didn't know much about the place other than it was old and charming, but the more time I spent there, the more unsettling things started happening. I first noticed something was off when I was alone one evening, cleaning the kitchen. I kept hearing these footsteps, loud, distinct, and they didn't seem like they were coming from anywhere specific. I would freeze and listen, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But no, it was more like someone was walking through the hall, just out of sight. The first few times I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, right? But this felt different, like something was walking with purpose. I wasn't alone for long. My friend Vanessa moved in with me a few weeks after I signed the lease. She was just starting to get out of a bad relationship, and I thought having her around would be good for both of us. But once she arrived, strange things kept happening. It wasn't long before she started feeling the same unease that I had, and things started escalating quickly. One night, Vanessa came into my room looking pale, like she had seen a ghost. She told me that she had been in bed, trying to sleep, when she saw a shadow standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall, dark, and featureless, just like a silhouette. It wasn't a trick of the light, she could feel it. And then, it was gone. I tried to brush it off, but the fear in her voice told me she wasn't imagining things. We didn't tell anyone about the footsteps or the shadow. Who would believe us? It seemed ridiculous even as I said it out loud, but the longer we stayed, the worse it got. Every night, I would hear those footsteps again. Sometimes they would stop just outside my door. Other times they'd walk through the house as if whoever or whatever was responsible was pacing. I tried to convince myself it was just the house's age, the floorboards creaking or the wind rattling the windows. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then things took an even darker turn. Vanessa was in the living room one evening, sitting on the couch and reading, when she suddenly heard something coming from the basement. A loud, heavy thud. She called out to me, but when I went to check, the basement door was shut tight, like it always was. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the door opened by itself. Slowly, creaking on its hinges, just like in the movies. It was almost as if something wanted us to know it was there. Over the next few weeks, the activity continued. The doors would open and close on their own, and one evening, we both heard the distinct sound of someone walking across the hardwood floors upstairs, even though we knew no one else was home. Vanessa was terrified, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. How could this be happening? One of the most terrifying things happened during a stormy night. The wind was howling outside, and we were curled up in the living room, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in the air. That's when we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. We both froze, and then the basement door slammed shut. No one was there. And I don't know how to explain it, but I swear that the temperature dropped immediately. It was as if the house itself was breathing, alive with a presence we couldn't see, but could feel all too well. After a few months, I tried to research the house's history. It wasn't just the usual things you find on Zillow or city archives. I dug into the old newspapers, and that's when I found it. A report from the 1880s about a man who had died in the house. His name was Samuel Burke, and he had been an army officer who was dismissed from service and fell into a deep depression. According to the article, he had died alone in that very house, and no one was sure whether it was a suicide or something more sinister. I was desperate for answers, so I started asking around. Some of the older residents of the neighborhood mentioned strange occurrences in that house over the years. Some said they'd seen lights flicker, doors creak open on their own, and a strange chill that never seemed to leave. But no one could explain who Samuel Burke really was, or what his lingering presence meant. One evening, Vanessa and I were sitting in the living room, trying to ignore the growing feeling of being watched when I heard a noise behind me. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, like footsteps on the stairs. I turned around, and there, standing in the hallway, was a figure, a tall, shadowy shape. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it wasn't human. It just stood there, motionless. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Vanessa saw it too. Her face drained of color, and she whispered, "Did you see that?" I nodded, too scared to say anything. The figure stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I don't know where it went, but I felt like it had been waiting for us, watching us the whole time. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the house had a presence of its own, and no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, it was always there, lurking in the background. I can't explain it, but it felt like we were never alone, like something was always watching, waiting, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We moved out a few weeks later, but I'll never forget the way the house felt. The dark, oppressive energy that hung in the air, the footsteps that echoed through the hallways, the shadows that moved in the corner of your eye. Even though we left, I feel like that house still has a hold on me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps or feel that same chilling presence. It's like it never really left, and I don't think it ever will. My name is Sam Wilkins. I'm 45 years old, and I live in San Diego, California. I've never been one to believe in haunted houses or curses. I always thought those were things people made up to sell movies or attract curious tourists. But after what happened to me in 2008, I could never look at those stories the same way again. That year, I was working as a freelance photographer specializing in photos of historical sites and so-called haunted places. It was part of a project called the Terror Tour, and the idea was to take photos and videos of the creepiest places and document anything out of the ordinary. I was excited about the job because honestly, I always thought it was just another excuse to travel and make good money. In May 2008, I was hired to photograph a famous house in California. It was the one used in the filming of the movie Poltergeist. The production of the movie had wrapped decades earlier, but the house's reputation was still strong, mainly because of the strange deaths surrounding the cast, like Heather O'Rourke, the little girl who played Carol Ann and died tragically young. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, a typical 70s construction. When I got there, the place looked completely normal, almost boring. The paint was a bit faded, and the garden looked neglected, but nothing out of the ordinary. The current owners apparently avoided giving interviews, but allowed some tourist visits, as long as they were scheduled and supervised by a guide. I got special permission to spend a few hours there alone, taking photos inside and out. Everything was fine at first. I took several photos of the living room, the staircase, the backyard. The place was empty and silent, which was perfect for my work. The only sounds I heard were the camera clicking and the gentle wind hitting the windows. After about 2 hours of shooting, I decided to explore the upstairs. The bedrooms were all pretty similar, small and decorated in a very generic way. But one room in particular made me feel uncomfortable. It was empty, with no furniture, just the wooden floor creaking whenever I stepped. That was when I first felt that strange sensation, like I was being watched. The feeling was so intense that I had to stop and take a deep breath. I looked around, trying to find a logical explanation, maybe some cold draft or weird reflection. But the room was quiet, static, almost suffocating. I decided to take some pictures anyway, trying to ignore the sensation. When I looked through the camera's viewfinder, I swear I saw something moving at the back of the room. It was quick, like a shadow sliding through the corner. But when I lowered the camera and looked directly, nothing was there. It was like the lens had picked up something my eyes couldn't see. I kept taking pictures, now somewhat obsessed with capturing that thing again. And that's when it got worse. Every time I looked through the viewfinder, that shadow seemed closer. Never clear enough for me to identify what it was, but always present, always moving slowly and steadily. I was starting to sweat, and my breathing was getting heavy. Even so, I kept photographing like a stubborn idiot. It was only when I heard a sound that resembled a whisper, something so low I almost thought it was just my imagination, that I realized I needed to get the hell out of there. I left the room quickly, trying not to look like a complete coward, but my whole body was shaking. I decided I had enough material and rushed down the stairs, practically running. While I was packing my equipment into my backpack, I kept hearing those muffled whispers. They weren't continuous, but would appear suddenly, like someone talking right next to me and then stopping. I left the house that same afternoon and went straight home to edit the photos. I thought that maybe, seeing the images on the computer, I'd be able to understand what had happened. But when I started reviewing the photos, I realized the problem was much worse than I imagined. The shadow appeared in almost every photo I took in that empty room. And the worst part, it seemed to be moving toward me, slowly, frame by frame. At first, it was just a dark blur in a corner of the room, but after a few shots, you could see something almost humanoid, hunched over, like it was crawling toward me. I deleted all the photos that same night. I erased the files from my computer and even broke the camera's memory card. The only thing I wanted was to forget everything and move on. But even now, so many years later, I still have nightmares of that shadow crawling toward me. I never took another job related to haunted places again. Call me a coward if you want, but after that day, I just wanted to stay as far away from anything like that as possible. And the worst part is, no matter how hard I try to ignore it, sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. My name is Evan. I am 37 years old and I live in San Francisco, California. What I am about to tell happened about 12 years ago, but it still gives me chills just thinking about it. I was working as a photographer for a tourism company, and on one of those trips to photograph historical places, we ended up at the famous Winchester Mansion, the house built by the widow of the rifle inventor. I had, of course, heard of Sarah Winchester and the mansion before. Everyone knows the legends about her. The woman who, after the death of her husband and daughter, built a crazy house to ward off the spirits of the people killed by her family's rifles. Stairs leading nowhere, doors opening to walls, all of it. When we learned we would be taking a guided tour, the whole team was excited but also a bit uneasy, you know? The story was just too creepy not to give you goosebumps. We arrived at the mansion in the afternoon on a cloudy day, which already gave it a weird vibe. The first thing I noticed when I entered was the feeling that everything there was erratic. The architecture was totally disconnected, as if they had tried to make something grand without any logic. The doors opened to walls and the stairs went up and down for no reason. It was impossible to make sense of it all. I was beginning to understand why people said Sarah Winchester believed she was surrounded by vengeful spirits. The guide explained that the house was built over more than 30 years without a clear plan, and that Sarah Winchester would only stop working when the construction reached a new level. During the tour, we walked through long, narrow corridors until we reached one of the weirdest stairs I had ever seen in my life. It climbed about 2 meters and abruptly stopped, leading nowhere. The guide mentioned that Sarah wanted the spirit of her husband, who died shortly after inventing the rifle, not to find her. But it seemed more like a warning, as if it was telling me not to try to understand what was going on there. As we walked through the house, I noticed that some rooms felt colder than others. In one of the rooms, I felt a cold breeze pass by me, but all the windows were closed. I looked to the side, and one of my colleagues, Mark, also seemed weird, with his arms crossed and staring intently at the hallway. I asked him what he had seen, but he just shook his head and said everything was fine. Something about his expression left me uncomfortable, but I let it go and kept taking pictures. By the end of the afternoon, the atmosphere was heavier, and there was no one else around. All the other tourists had already left, and my team was still taking photos. That's when things really started to get strange. We were on the upper floor, near a series of rooms and a small corridor, when I heard the sound of a creaking door. I thought it might be the guide, maybe showing some curious detail, but when I looked, she was quite far from where I was. I walked over to the door that was creaking, thinking it might be one of those weird doors that opened to nothing. When I got there, I noticed that there was no solid wall, but something different. It seemed like an opening, but when I touched it, I felt resistance, as if I was pushing against something invisible. The most disturbing part was the sound that followed. A low, almost imperceptible crack, but enough to make my skin crawl. It wasn't a normal sound of wood or metal. It was like something moving behind a layer of air. Something I shouldn't be touching. I quickly left the place, but what happened afterward left me completely unnerved. I went back to find the guide and the others, but no one seemed to have heard anything. I couldn't get it out of my head for a long time until I heard the guide mention something about an old mansion worker who disappeared decades ago. They say he was last seen near that corridor, but no trace of him was ever found. That left a knot in my stomach, as if suddenly everything made sense, but at the same time, it didn't. That night, back at the hotel, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched lingered. My colleagues were all tired, but I was restless. During the early morning, I started looking up stories about the house on my phone and found an account from another visitor saying he had felt something similar. He mentioned hearing footsteps coming from inside the walls, as if something was there, moving in the dark. His description matched what I felt, a heaviness in the air, a silent presence crawling through the corridors. The next day, I went back to the mansion to take a few extra pictures, and that door I had touched was closed again. Not only that, but there was no sign that anything had been altered overnight. The house remained its unbothered existence, as if nothing had happened. However, the feeling that something was hidden there never left me, and it stayed with me for weeks. To this day, when I think about that afternoon, I feel a strange chill running down my spine. I have gone back to the mansion a few times, always trying to find that door again, but I never managed to. The guide on the last visit said I might be confusing it with another part of the house, but I know what I saw and felt that day. It wasn't just a trick of the mind or a suggestion because of the stories. There was something there, something that didn't want to be found. If any of you have been there and felt something similar, please share it. Because so far I have never fully understood what happened, and the doubt haunts me to this day. Was Sarah really building all that to confuse the spirits? Or did the mansion itself become a kind of trap, capturing anyone who dares to uncover its secrets? If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like to support the community. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new content. See you next time.